This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I am super excited to get into this topic. It is a big one. It is going to be slightly uncomfortable just because we're going to be discussing and unpacking rage. And I feel like the emotion rage itself, or rage or anger, if we just kind of take it away from the context of talking about race and diversity and inclusion, all that kind of stuff, if we just talk about rage as an emotion, it is definitely an emotion that we feel uncomfortable around. It is, it's a lot. It's a lot to handle. It's a lot to have that feeling and know what to do with it. And it's not often framed as, a great emotion to have or something to strive to feel like. And just like how it plays out emotionally, I feel like when we talk about when we are talking about race and talking about inclusion and equity, rage also comes up in that context as well, and something that we try to, or when I say we, I mean we as a society, we try to smother and try to move away from. And so I wanted to start off this episode by reading parts of a poem that really stood out to me. And this poem, I have mentioned this wonderful person on the podcast before, and manifesting vibes that I can have them on the show sometime in the future. But this poem is written by Tusiata Avia, and this poem is, the context of this poem is that it was written in response to the complaints about her and her mahi in the New Zealand or Aotearoa Media Council ruling. And the poem itself is quite long, but I will just read parts of it that really jumped out to me. The neighbours hear me writing a poem about colonisation, and they yell, "Stop that race baiting. Our kids are trying to sleep." Later, my white neighbour will come over to my house and say, "Let me explain something to you, Tusiata. Racism is like a scab on your knee, and if you pick it, what will happen? Leave it alone and it will heal. Otherwise, I fear the wound will get infected. And what will happen then, huh? What will happen to me then?" When I write a poem, it turns into a hate crime right then and there. It springs off the page and marches out into the street like an army of 10,000 colonial soldiers armed with guns. My poem steals my neighbour's land and everybody's land. My poem steals 94% of all the land in New Zealand. It steals millions upon millions of acres land. My poem is no accident. My poem does all these things on purpose. My poem has a plan to take over everyone and everything. And I really recommend reading the poem yourself. She uses quotes from actual complaints quoted in the report, and I think it says a lot about how we respond to rage, specifically if it's rage coming from communities that aren't privileged or communities that aren't dominated, or who aren't the dominators in the way that our system is currently structured. And, when people respond to this rage, the response is usually to try to smother it or minimize it or make it something to be feared. And I yeah, it says a lot about how we respond to Black rage or rage from our Indigenous communities, our other communities that don't have that access to privilege. So before we really get into the kōrero, what actually is Black rage? Because I think the word rage or anger has connotations of like hatred or this sense of bitterness. But actually the rage is this desire for equality and a craving for justice. This rage is kind of coming from that feeling of this, whatever the racism or whatever this system is, it needs to stop. And it's a rage that kind of signals that people are tired. They're tired of being tired and tired of suffering and want to feel dignified and respected and want to have access to equality. Whenever I think about Black rage and how it's responded to, I came across this and it was a perfect example of how Black rage is met in a very white-centered system. And this specific example came after a Minnesota police officer gunned down a Black man called Philando Castile. And someone tweeted, Damian Lillard tweeted, that Black people take better care of each other, then they can come to the battle, further in demanding what we be treated better from others. And then someone else tweeted and kind of has said, tweeted something of a similar vibe, which was, I've always said we, as Black people, if you want respect, you've got to give each other respect. You can't demand respect from white people and the cops if we don't respect each other. And civil rights leader Andrew Young mocked Black Lives Matter protesters who blocked traffic in downtown Atlanta as quote-unquote unlovable little brats. And Young also went on to say that he feared they would mess up the climate we have taken 50 years to build, which I think says a lot about how we respond to Black rage, because there's this idea that if you want to achieve justice or if you want to ask for more or to be better, then you need to be respected first. And there's no space for rage when there's no space for rage when you want that level of respect, which is ridiculous. I think that is how we smother Black rage in a way to maintain the status quo. And you definitely, that attitude isn't just restricted to a particular group of people. I mean, if you have internalized the white system that we live in and that racism, there's definitely an attitude. Personally, I have observed that attitude among my POC friends and my community. It's this respectability, which I think this respectability or the idea of it is what suffocates rage. This is what this idea of Black rage is and where it comes from. And it's this rage of being tired of the suffering and demanding change and justice now. And this is in contrast with white rage. And white rage is not talking about this sense of bitterness or hatred again, which is what the word rage implies, but it's talking about white rage is policies that undermine blackness, Black achievement and advancement. And it's these policies that kind of condemn the quote unquote violence. And so white rage is more about policy. And so, of course, when this rage is not visceral, it's seen as more respectable, and it slips under the radar. And I feel like black rage and white rage have kind of been toying with each other in every single in this like civil rights movement, on the road to achieving equity. You know, whenever there has been an advancement for black communities, then this white rage is directly in combat with that. But because this white rage is more respectable, it's allowed. It's not suffocated. It is upheld by the system, whereas black rage is demeaned and, you know, meant to be told by the system that, hey, you are not allowed here. Your rage is not allowed here. There's no room for there's no room for you because your behavior isn't respected right now. And, you know, there's already connotations about, you know, if you're not white, there's this idea of you're savage or not civil, and the rage, unfortunately, is forced into that picture. And I think one of the reasons why it can be upheld. And I know that that this idea of rage is very applicable in the Aotearoa context, but I wanted to kind of go through the history of America and kind of talk about what's happened, or kind of use the American history to kind of highlight this tug and pull between black rage, white rage, and how, you know, white rage really seems to rear its head when there is progress happening for black communities. And, you know, white rage is kind of cloaked in respectability and law and order, but nevertheless, it's still rage. And I think when we talk about rage, especially in the context of civil rights movement or race relations, you know, people often go to protests and looting, and that captures attention. But there is also rage in, you know, in the meetings where officials who have the power and the privilege to change things, they decide to redraw precincts to dilute African American voting strength, or, you know, officials who aim to slash the government payrolls that have a long time been sources of black employment. And this white rage is, you know, entirely upheld by the system, and it kind of goes by unnoticed. Like it's invisible because it's a rage that isn't taken to the streets, and it isn't heard or met with more violence, or met with you know, attitudes that aim to reduce, because, you know, white rage has this feeling or aura of respectability, and it also is a type of rage that has access to, you know, sources of privilege, being courts and the police and governors, and it has happened time and time again. I feel like, you know, especially with what happened in 2020 and the resurgence or a new wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel like rage, or the idea of rage has kind of come to the forefront a lot recently, with people going to the streets and taking their rage to the streets, which is absolutely valid, and there's no need to water that rage down with respectability. But I feel like rage has been more prevalent in our conversations recently, but actually white rage and black rage has been reoccurring in history time and time again, and you can often see it whenever there is advancement for African Americans. That reaction or the backlash to that is white rage. For example, when the Civil War happened, when the Supreme Court decision of Brown and Board of Education, which was a huge moment for black people to get education, white rage came through there again to undermine the Supreme Court. The emancipation, when that white rage came through again, when black people had more freedom. And so in response to that, the South scrambled to change laws to reinstate white supremacy and bring back that legitimacy of slavery, which is crazy. And so lawmakers in several states, they created the Black Codes, which essentially criminalized blackness, and that allowed and legitimatized, forced labor, and completely undermined any sense of democracy. And it's absolutely it just makes me feel so, personally, just makes me feel so uneasy, because the way that we ascribe black rage to be something so, like something to be feared and something to be minimized, and, something to legitimize the notion that actually this is, it really dehumanizes. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, it really dehumanizes blackness, which is so gross. And speaking of the Brown and Board of Education decision, when that happened, which is a ruling of separate public schools for black and white students, which affirmed African Americans' rights as citizens, there was more more white rage in response to that. And the most obvious signs of that rage was bricks and mobs at school doors. But 101 members of Congress issued the Southern Manifesto, which essentially declared war on the Brown decision. And governors all over, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, and other places, they launched a resistance, and they created a doctrine that made any federal law or court decision null if a state disagreed with it. And so they passed that legislation and actually withheld that public funding from any school that would have normally received that public funding because of the decision made in Brown. And they shut down public schools and used tax dollars to ensure that whites would continue their education at racially exclusive private academies. And so there were no viable options left for black children. And I know that happened back in the 50s, but this idea of white rage still continues on and is still relevant to this day. The election of Obama was a huge deal, the first black president, and that kind of gave hope that there was this new racial climate, or it would herald a new era in America. But actually, those hopeful feelings were just quickly cut, and were very short-lived, because after Obama's the election of Obama, there was voter suppression legislation, a lot of crazy Supreme Court decisions which kind of upheld whiteness and undermined blackness, a lot of stand your ground laws, and continuing police brutality that just made it very clear that white rage was heard loud and clear. And the fact that America had elected their first black president actually hadn't made a huge deal, which is scary. I think that the fact that white rage is seen as respectable, and because it's seen as respectable, is upheld in the system of whiteness, whereas black rage, which is very justified, because even if you don't think about, if you we walk away from the context of race and race relations, or the racial climate, if we kind of take a step back from that, when someone does something wrong to us, when they really hurt us, and not even in a minor sense, in a deeply traumatic way, when someone hurts us and continually hurts you, it's a very natural human response to get angry about that, and to take that away from black people, or to take that away from any community that doesn't have access to that privilege. And when they do express that rage, to take that away from them, it's really, really dehumanizing. And I think we don't talk about it often, the fact that there's also white rage that is allowed and is invisible in the system, because the system allows it to be, but because black rage is so visible, to a point where it's like, look at what's happening to me. To deny the reality is also to deny the black rage. And I think there are so many harmful things that happens when we deny black rage. And the first thing that comes to mind is that it allows the current system to be maintained. The status quo is being fed. For example, like whenever we deny rage, it allows stolen lands to remain colonized, for investments to remain profitable, for whiteness to remain strong and ruthless, for black rage to be neutralized. All of these things happen when we deny black rage. And the thing about this is that, and I think the reason why the system prioritizes that black rage is neutralized, suppressed, minimized, diminished, is that black rage says this is the reality. This is the problem. This is the harms that are being done. It's directly saying, look at our suffering. And the way that the system is set up, it is built on the back of that suffering. And to allow black rage would be to crush the system as we know it. But, those with the system wants to hold on to that power imbalance and to keep feeding those with privilege to have it, and those who don't have it to stay small. And so there's space for the dominant privileged ones, which I think if we were to ever create change or to ever embrace a more equitable society, we need to, instead of shying away from black rage, we need to hold on to it even more. And another thing that happens when we deny black rage is that it maintains the dehumanization of black people. because to embrace one's full humanity is to embrace one's full existence, being, experience. And I've said this on the podcast time and time again, and once you are really, like, your eyes are sharply aware to it, you will see it everywhere. But those who have access to privilege always have the ability to be their full selves, to be able to communicate whatever they're experiencing, to be able to live the full human experience. And our systems and society will see that and allow it. But if you come from communities that don't have that privilege, you will be put into boxes. You won't be, for example, that stereotype of the angry black woman is so strong. I feel like I really have to watch myself with when I am angry, how I express it, because the way that people respond to it, I cannot experience my anger fully. It's always taken into something else and made into something else, when in fact I feel like if I am able to express my anger, it actually shouldn't be the anger that is the biggest issue, but rather we should I wish there were more conversations about what made me angry in the first place. And I think that same extends to how we respond to black rage. I think people try to minimize, like if we thought about black rage as a fire, people try to smother that fire and talk about how much damage it does. Oh, that fire was so big, it burnt me, it destroyed this house, destroyed blah, blah, blah. When actually I think we should, as a society, we should be asking more questions about, well, what started that fire in the first place? Why is... what is the fuel for the fire and what actually is happening there? But instead we focus so much on the fire itself that we just completely deny the existence of the problem to begin with, which is how the system, one of the ways that the system maintains itself. And it's easy to keep the system going. But it also maintains the system by ways of dehumanizing people. And when you dehumanize people, it's a surefire way of the system maintaining itself, because if you dehumanize the communities without the privilege, it's hard to empathize. It's hard to see the struggles as a legit problem. It's hard to then advocate and fight for those communities. And I think when we talk about race, I think it's not as it's still rather obvious. We still have a lot of issues, don't get me wrong, but I feel like overall it's changed and it's become more insidious, and in the sense that it's more casual and swept under the carpet now, and it's not as obvious to pick out, because I feel like our collective awareness of racism, or the conversations, is changed from racism is bad to talking more about, respectability politics, and talking more about microaggressions and casual racism and systemic racism, the ways that it's more swept under the carpet. And because it's swept under the carpet, it's harder to pick out the fact that people actually are still... It was held... or the Day of Rage, which is what it's abbreviated to, was held on the eve of Indigenous Peoples Day, and that's a holiday to commemorate the Native American peoples, which began Indigenous Peoples Day. The kaupapa behind that, it started as a counter celebration held on the same day as the federal holiday of Columbus Day, which celebrates the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas way back in 1492. And so the city of Portland has recognized Indigenous Peoples Day since 2015, and the Day of Rage was organised in 2020, so in the middle of the pandemic and the George Floyd protests. I feel like 2020 was the year of rage. And so, the Day of Rage was organised in 2020 when, among a series of demonstrations and in response to the murder of George Floyd. And part of the protest was removal of monuments and memorials, that were associated with racial injustice. And so this particular Day of Rage, this event attracted about 200 people. Demonstrators toppled the statue of Abraham Lincoln and I honestly don't know how to say the middle name, so I'll just say Alexander Proctor's statue of Roosevelt, and vandalized the Oregon Historical Society. And then, Dakota 38 was spray painted on the memorial base, and that was in reference to his role in a mass execution of Native Americans in Minnesota in 1862. And the protest was declared a riot, and some of the protesters were charged with And the response to it, I think, says a lot about, especially what we've been talking about this whole entire episode. It says a lot. So the city's mayor Ted Wheeler said the event was not an act of social justice and called the rioters' actions an attack on institutions that support the oppressed people protesters are defending. And then during a press conference, Ted Wheeler said that there were the presence of vandals. The police chief, Chuck Lavelle, described the damage. Said, there was just a lot of damage. A member of Congress described the destruction as, she condemned it and said, the violence doesn't work for us. We know that during the time of Standing Rock, the elders told us violence is not going to help. We also know, just in reality here, that we cannot tear down the system using fire or rocks or destruction and then build it back up from nothing. And Donald Trump, or the president at the time, also tweeted about the protest, and the first one was taking advantage of fools, law and order, Portland, call in the feds, and the second one was these are Biden fools, radicals, get them, FBI, get them now. And the third one was the FBI and law enforcement must focus their energy on the radical left, those who have spent the summer trying to burn down poorly run Democrat cities throughout USA. And then the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable released a statement, and I will just read a little bit of it, not the full statement, but they said, we, the members of the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable, disapprove of the destruction and theft of property and threat of violence by those participating in demonstrations last night. As with other resistance movements who have turned out in countless numbers this year, we understand that there is a justifiable and righteous indignation over the unconscionable mistreatment of our people and communities over centuries, and that Indigenous Peoples Day is a time to reflect and speak out against these injustices. Yet, we cannot condone pointless acts of vandalism and the brandishing of weapons that serve only to detract from the real message that must be heard. Indigenous people continue to suffer at the will of systems designed to eradicate our self-determination, culture, economies, and families. Until we dismantle those systems, there will be no justice. So this specific incident, there are a lot of different opinions about the violence and the harms that those violent acts have caused. And I think I just want to make a quick note here that there is a really big difference between rage or anger and then violence as well. And so I'm not 100% applauding all of the actions that happened, but what I would like to really point out is that the characterization of these actions and demeaning it to nothing. Even, for example, Donald Trump's tweets about these are Biden fools and these are the radical left, when actually there's nothing radical about this anger when you think about the violence and the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples over so many years, and that anger should never really be reduced or radicalized like that, because it makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's quite rational to be quite angry and feel a lot of rage when you think about what's happened. And I think what happens, the way that we handle this rage as a society, is that it's kind of built into something that's so violent. That's all either people talk about rather than talking about what's actually happened. And the statement that the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable put out, which where they disapproved of the destruction and theft of property, but also said, until we dismantle those systems, there will be no justice. But in this statement, they still allowed space and they allowed room for that rage, which we as a society, we don't. And if we go back to how we started this episode with Tusiata's poem, the ways of reducing that rage, or the way that rage is transformed into something bigger, more violent, more hateful, to the point where the actual problem at hand is ignored. You can see how that comes through. In her poem, she says, "Here I go, writing a racist rant about one of history's greatest explorers." And then this poem is borderline terrorism, when I think we forget about the fact of we forget about the terror and the wrongs that have been done to non-privileged communities for such a long time. We've normalized that. And so when we have normalized it so much, where said communities then speak up on their rage about the injustice that's happened, that we then turn that into an act of terror to further reinstate the status quo, is really not all good. And I think I wish we didn't shy away from the rage, and welcomed the rage as part of the kōrero and as part of the kaupapa. And I'm not approving violent actions when I say this, but that emotion of rage, I feel like we need to accept that rather than deny that rage, because we won't have that transformational change without welcoming the rage. The rage is really important. When talking about rage from non-privileged communities, I hope we work towards welcoming it and embracing it. I feel like even on a casual basis, we've just absorbed this. We as a society, we've absorbed this attitude so much. Like, it's normal to deny that rage as opposed to thinking about it and talking about it and welcoming it. And not only is it just that rage, but actually it's the tensions between the rage of non-privileged communities and and white rage, and how that plays its role as well, because it's not just rage coming from non-privileged communities, but it's that rage that comes from privileged communities, and how that rage then fuels the fire to maintain those systems. And if we go back to talking about the history of America and talking about the tension between white rage and black rage, we need to be, I would love for everyone who's tuned into this episode to think about the role that white rage plays into it as well, and how that rage is heard loud and clear because it's so silently slinkered into our systems, as opposed to, being so loud and visceral. Like if we think about any time there's police brutality and a black life has been lost because of that brutality, it's not just about black rage at the criminal system, but it's about that white rage that protects those who did the wrong in the first place. And, when we're thinking about white rage, we should be thinking about how, a Florida judge instructed a jury to specifically only focus on the moment when George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin interacted. So instead of the jury looking at George and Trayvon as innocent 17-year-old human beings, they were dehumanized and reduced into scary black guys who are dangerous, as opposed to, as opposed to the grown men who stalked them through the neighborhood with a loaded gun. And that is who white rage aims to protect. Think about white rage when you're looking at the assault on the Voting Rights Act. Look at how white rage protects and reinstates the status quo. Look, how white rage came through in Connick and Thompson. And it was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision in 2011, which, is still recent times, that ruled it was legal for a city prosecutor staff to hide evidence that exonerated a black man who was rotting on death row for 14 years. Think about black rage and the tension between black rage and white rage when white people, a recent study came out from Stanford University. Researchers found that when white people were told that black Americans were incarcerated in numbers far beyond their proportion of the population, they reported being more afraid of crime and more likely to support the kinds of policies that widen the gap between racial disparities, and, supporting policies like 3 strikes or the stop and frisk laws. And you can see how white rage plays a role in that. And again, with the racial divide that we're experiencing, it's those with privilege that are always seen, heard, supported, and prioritized, but those without the privilege are dehumanized, marginalized, minimized. And the same goes exactly with rage as well. And so I wish as a society we wouldn't shy away from rage, but actually make space for rage from non-privileged communities and actually see white rage, because right now it's invisible, and because it's invisible, no one sees anything, and it's allowed and it's supported, and it's like this monster that's continually being fed, as opposed to black rage. Because it is so visible, it's easier to squish down and made to be nothing, when it actually should really be hurt, and it's justifiable. And On that fiery note, I will end this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.